Okay, now let's move on to the skeletal system. So the components of the skeletal system is going to be the bones, obviously, but also cartilage, ligaments, and any other connective tissue that helps stabilize the bones. Bones are going to be the primary organs of the skeletal system. They provide a rigid framework for the body. They aid in movement. They are levers, basically, that your muscles pull on. Let's see, they are involved in mineral storage, calcium and phosphorus in particular. They're also involved in energy storage. The yellow bone marrow is fat or adipose tissue that is stored inside of bones, and bones are involved in hematopoiesis and the red bone marrow. Okay, so that's just some of the functions of bones. So you have two types of bone. You're going to have compact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone is also called dense or cortical bone, and it's relatively a dense connective tissue. It appears white, smooth, and solid, and it's 80% of your bone mass. Spongy bone is called cancellous or trabecular bone. It's internal to the compact bone, so it's on the inside. The compact bone essentially forms kind of like a husk around the bone itself. Spongy bone appears porous, and it only makes up 20% of the bone mass. Next, you have cartilage. This is a semi-rigid connective tissue. It's definitely more flexible than bone is. And there's two types of cartilage that you'll find in the skeletal system. The first is hyaline cartilage. This is going to be what attaches your ribs to your sternum. This is also called costal cartilage when you're talking about that cartilage in the rib area. Hyaline cartilage also covers ends of some bones. You'll see it listed as articular cartilage at the end of the bones. This is to prevent wear and tear on the bone itself with movement of the joint. Cartilage is found within the growth plates of a developing person. In fact, cartilage is the model for which most bones in the body are going to form. Most of the bones first lay down a cartilage blueprint and then fill that blueprint in with minerals, and that makes the bone. The second type of cartilage in the skeletal system is going to be fibrocartilage, and this is weight-bearing cartilage that's going to withstand compression. So you're going to find it in places that have a lot of weight on them, so the intervertebral discs being chief among those, but you'll also find cartilage in the knees as well, and fibrocartilage makes up the pubic symphysis. Next, you have ligaments. These are dense, regular connective tissue, and ligaments anchor bone to bone, whereas tendons are going to connect muscle to bone, and tendons are also dense, regular connective tissue. So this slide is just showing you where all the cartilage can be found. Here's the costal cartilage that connects the ribs to the sternum. Here on the end of these long bones is the articular cartilage. And remember, both of these types of cartilage are going to be hyaline cartilage, okay? You can also see articular cartilage down here on the ends of the femur. Fibrocartilage you're going to find here in the intervertebral discs and the pubic symphysis and the meniscus of the knees. This image is showing how hyaline cartilage makes up the epiphyseal plate and allows for the bone to grow lengthwise. This cartilage basically proliferates, lengthening the bone, and then later cells come in and lay down the minerals that harden the bone. Okay, so I already mentioned most of these functions, support and protection. So it's going to give you a framework for the body, but it's also going to protect your delicate organs. So bones that make up the skull or the cranium, for instance, protect the brain, whereas the bones that make up the rib cage are going to protect the thoracic organs. Bones also aid in movement. They're going to serve as the attachment site for muscles. And they're going to be a system of levers, which muscle contraction is going to cause to move. Bone is also involved in hematopoiesis. This is blood cell production, and it occurs in the red bone marrow. The storage of mineral and energy reserves is also another function of bone. Bone stores the body's reserve of calcium and phosphate, but it also has yellow bone marrow, which is an adipose storage site, so energy reserves as well. There are 4 classes of bone determined by shape. It's going to be long bone, short bone, flat bone, and irregular bones, okay? So your long bones, those are the most common ones. Those are going to be bones like the femur, the humerus, the radius, the ulna, etc. Even your phalanges are considered long bones. Then you've got short bones. These are going to be, the length is almost equal to width. So it's going to be your carpal bones, your tarsal bones, and your patella. You can have flat bones. These are often slightly curved. So an example would be the scapula, the sternum, the bones of the skull, and the ribs. And then you've got some irregular bones in your body that make elaborate and complex shapes. You will see some of those in the facial bones, in the base of the cranium, that make up the base of the cranium. That's primarily where you're going to see irregular bones. Okay, so our first question here is, what type of bone is the patella? So if you look back here, we have patella is listed as a short bone, but that's not one of our choices here. Instead, it's going to be a sesamoid bone, okay? And a sesamoid bone is a small bone that's embedded in a tendon or muscle near a joint. This class of bone is based on origin and not shape, but they do tend to be small and round in shape. And it's interesting to note that the patella doesn't actually start developing until about age 2. So here you have a normal knee radiograph in an adult human. You have the patella right here. If we look at the same kind of image in a infant, you'll see the patella is actually missing. So it has not started developing in this child yet. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the regions of a long bone. So we'll talk about the diaphysis, the medullary cavity, the epiphysis, the metaphysis, and the epiphyseal plate. So first is the diaphysis. That's going to be the shaft of the bone, the long portion of the bone. It provides leverage and weight support. And it's going to be compact bone on the outside with thin spicules of spongy bone extending inward. And you can kind of see that here. Next is the medullary cavity. This is the hollow cylindrical space within the diaphysis. It's going to contain your bone marrow. In children, it's going to be primarily red bone marrow. And in adults, it's going to be primarily yellow bone marrow in most of your long bones. Next is the epiphysis. This is the kind of the knobby part at the end of each long bone. There's the proximal epiphysis, which is the end of the bone closest to the trunk of the body. So this is a humerus. This part would be the proximal epiphysis. So this is the shoulder area. That's closer to the trunk of the body than the elbow area, which is down here, which would be the distal epiphysis, okay? The epiphysis is composed of an outer thin layer of compact bone and spongy bone inside, and sometimes has articular cartilage that covers the joint surface. This is going to be a thin layer of hyaline cartilage, and it functions to absorb shock in the joints that move. Next is the metaphysis. This is the region of mature bone between the diaphysis and epiphysis. So it's going to be right here, kind of just a narrow region. Then you have the epiphyseal plate. This is in the metaphysis. It's also known as the growth plate. You can see here the epiphyseal line. This is the remnant of the epiphyseal plate because as you are growing, the epiphyseal plate provides for lengthwise bone growth. So cartilage will grow at the epiphyses and lengthen the bone. And then you will lay down hydroxyapatite and mineralize that cartilage afterwards. And then at the end of your growth, the epiphyseal plate will close up, ossify, and then it's called the epiphyseal line. And here you can see in growing bones, you can see the epiphysis, the physis, which is the growth plate itself, the metaphysis, and down here the diaphysis that would continue, okay? This is the wrist. So would this epiphysis be the proximal or the distal epiphysis? Well, it would be the distal epiphysis, right? Because it's the part of the bone that's farther away from the trunk of the body. Questions. What is the shaft of a long bone called? Diaphysis, epiphysis, osteoclast, or osteoblast? This one should be easy for you to get. It's the diaphysis. Which part of a long bone contains the growth plate or the epiphyseal plate during development? Well, that's going to be B, your metaphysis. And if you go back and look, you can see right here the epiphyseal line kind of on the edge of the metaphysis. You can see it a little bit better here. Okay, next question is what type of tissue primarily makes up the outer layer of the diaphysis in a long bone? And if you remember, we said the outer layer of bone is going to be compact bone, or B. Which structure within the long bone is responsible for the production of blood cells? The epiphysis, the diaphysis, the medullary cavity, or the periosteum? Well, this answer is going to be C, the medullary cavity. Okay, next is the periosteum. This is going to be the sheath that covers the outer surface of the bone. And there's two layers to it. There's an outer layer that's made of dense, irregular connective tissue. And then there's an inner layer which is made up of cells. The outer layer, it functions to protect the bone. It also anchors blood vessels and nerves to the bone surface, and it serves as an attachment site for the ligaments and tendons. The intercellular layer is going to have osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts. And these guys are going to be involved in the building and remodeling of bone. The periosteum is attached to the bone by collagen fibers that are called perforating fibers. And let me see, I think I have a picture of it. You can see here they're kind of at a 90-degree angle to the periosteum, and they perforate through there and into the bone, joining the periosteum to the bone. Here is that dense regular connective tissue outer layer, and then here's that intercellular layer. And then here is the bone. This is just another picture showing you the outer fibrous layer. You can kind of see the collagen fibers here. And then here you have the intercellular layer, also called the osteogenic layer. And you've got osteoprogenitor cells, you've got osteoblasts, you've got some osteoclasts, okay? And these guys are going to be working to lay down bone and resorb bone depending on what the osteocytes tell them to do. And we'll talk more about that here in just a few minutes. Okay, so which layer of the periosteum contains osteoblasts? Is it going to be the outer fibrous layer, the inner, or also called cambium layer, the perforating fibers layer, or the medullary layer? Well, C and D don't exist really, so it's going to be B, the inner layer. Remember that the inner layer is cellular, so it's going to contain the osteoblasts. How does the periosteum contribute to bone repair? So, A, by supplying nutrients through blood vessels, B, by providing a surface for muscle attachment, C, by secreting synovial fluid, or D, by facilitating nerve signal transmission. Well, bone repair, you need to be thinking A. It supplies nutrients through blood vessels, right, that it anchors down. Bone repair, any kind of repair, tissue repair, is going to require blood flow, right, to bring in cells that repair and bring in nutrients and things like that. Next is the endosteum. This is going to cover all the internal surfaces of bone. So it's going to cover the medullary cavity, and it's going to include the central canals of the osteons. The endosteum contains osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts. So it's got the same mix of cells that the intercellular layer of the periosteum has, okay? And just to give a little background to where these cells come from. So you have osteoprogenitor cells that are going to differentiate into an osteoblast. Now, osteoblasts build bone. Just remember the B's. BBB, osteoblast builds bone. And it does that by secreting a substance called osteoid first, and then it's going to mature into an osteocyte. Okay, and then an osteocyte does not build bone. It is a mechanoreceptor that picks up the different stresses and forces that are being applied to your bone. And it tells the osteoblasts or the osteoclasts to build or destroy bone based on where the stress and weight bearing is on the bone. Osteoclasts break down bone, and they are actually derived from the monocyte or macrophage precursors in the hematopoietic cell line. So they come from an entirely different cell line. And the way to remember this, in my opinion, is to remember that macrophages and monocytes are phagocytes, right? They like to eat things. Well, so does an osteoclast. It just eats bone instead of pathogens, okay? So same kind of mechanism as far as cells devouring something. And that's because the osteoclasts derive from myeloid progenitor cells. And you can see that here. Under the influence of CSF1, differentiates into a monocyte, and then under the influence of just CSF1, it'll go on to the macrophage, but if you have CSF1 and rank L, it'll go on to an osteoclast. So it just depends on what signaling molecules there are. That is what determines what the myeloid progenitor cell becomes. So unlike cartilage, which is avascular or lacks blood vessels, bone is highly vascular, especially spongy bone. You're going to see vessels entering from the periosteum, right? We said the periosteum anchors them in place. There are sometimes little holes in the bone called nutrient foramina, or a nutrient foramen as the singular. It's going to be a small opening in the bone where an artery and a vein are passing through. You'll also see nerves that pass through the foramen as well. And nerves are going to innervate the bone, the periosteum, the endosteum, and the marrow cavity. And these are going to be sensory nerves as opposed to motor nerves. And that should make sense because bone tissue doesn't actually move. It is involved in movement, but it is as the levers of movement. Muscle tissue is what actually moves. Okay, so there really shouldn't be any motor neurons supplying bone. It's mostly sensory nerves. Okay, so here you have a long bone. This is the femur. On the outside, you have the periosteum. Then you have, going inwards, compact bone. And then you've got spongy bone and then the medullary cavity. Here you have a nutrient foramen, and through it, a nutrient artery and vein that feeds the bone. And of course, you've got the diaphysis, the metaphysis, and the epiphysis, okay? Okay, so bone marrow is the soft connective tissue of bone. There's red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. Red bone marrow is also called myeloid tissue. It's hematopoietic, which means it's blood cell forming. It is composed of reticular connective tissue, immature blood cells, and adipose. In children, red bone marrow is going to be located in the spongy bone in the medullary cavity of their long bones. In adults, it's going to be limited to a few select areas, primarily flat bones, so like the skull and the ribs and the sternum, but also vertebrae and your hip bones as well, the ossa coxae. And this is showing you an image of the head of a femur. If you cut it in half, so down that way, and looked inside of it, you would see red bone marrow on the outside and then yellow bone marrow on the inside. So bone connective tissue, or osseous connective tissue, is a primary component of bone. Bone, just like every other connective tissue, is going to be composed of formed cells and an extracellular matrix. Okay, so the cells of bone, there's 4 types of cells. There's osteoprogenitor cells, which become osteoblasts, which then some of them go on to become osteocytes. And then there's the osteoclasts, and remember, they come from that myeloid progenitor line. The osteoprogenitor cells, these are going to be the stem cells of your bone. They're derived from the mesenchyme. When they divide, division is going to yield a stem cell, right, to keep on dividing, and a committed cell, or a cell that goes on to become an osteoblast. Osteoprogenitor cells are going to be located in the periosteum, so in that inner cellular layer of the periosteum, and in the endosteum as well, so the inner lining of bone. Osteoblasts, we said these are formed from osteoprogenitor stem cells. They are cuboidal shaped. They synthesize and secrete osteoid, which is the initial semi-solid organic form of bone matrix. Osteoid then later calcifies. When it calcifies, the osteoblasts become entrapped within that matrix, and then they go on to differentiate into osteocytes. Osteocytes, these are mature bone cells. They are derived from osteoblasts. They do not have bone forming abilities, so they are essentially osteoblasts that lost the ability to form bone. What they do is they help maintain the bone matrix. They sense stress and weight and force, and then they signal to the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts and tell them what to do. Osteoclasts, these are large multinuclear phagocytic cells that are involved in bone resorption. So these guys break down bones. Okay, so a couple questions here. What role do osteoprogenitor cells play in bone physiology? A, they are responsible for bone resorption. No, that's osteoclasts. B, they differentiate into osteoblasts to form new bone. Yes, that is true. Osteoprogenitor cells differentiate into osteoblasts, which then go on to form new bone. C, they maintain the mineral content of bones. No, that's going to be osteocytes that maintain the bone. D, they produce the collagen matrix in bone. No, they don't have any role in that. Which bone is primarily involved in the maintenance of bone tissue and the regulation of mineral content? So we said maintenance of bone tissue is going to be osteocytes, so A. Which type of bone cell is primarily responsible for the resorption of bone tissue? A, osteocytes. No, those maintain bone tissue. B, osteoblasts. No, those build up bone tissue. C, osteoclasts. Yes, it is C. They are responsible for resorption of bone tissue. And D, remember that osteoprogenitor cells go on to differentiate into osteoblasts. Okay, osteocytes are derived from which type of bone cell? A, osteoblasts. Yes, osteoblasts. Remember, it goes osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts. The osteoblasts then secrete osteoid. The osteoid calcifies. The osteoblast is stuck where it is, and it differentiates into an osteocyte. So the matrix of bone has organic and inorganic components. The organic components are going to be osteoid. This is produced by osteoblasts, and it contains collagen and a semi-solid ground substance of proteoglycans and glycoproteins. Right, so organic components, this is going to be what? Molecules with carbon and hydrogen involved in it. So that's going to be collagen, proteoglycans, and glycoproteins. All of these are going to give bone tensile strength by resisting stretching, and that contributes to bone flexibility. So in other words, the bones are not brittle. The inorganic components, you'll see calcium phosphate interacts with calcium hydroxide to form hydroxyapatite, and that's going to be the primary inorganic component of bone tissue. What happens is the osteoid comes first, there's a bunch of collagen proteins in it, and then hydroxyapatite crystals start to form around those collagen fibers. Those fibers provide a nidus in which they can start to precipitate, and they precipitate into crystals. Then they harden, and this accounts for the rigidity of bones. Okay, so bone formation, we said osteoblasts secrete osteoid. That osteoid then gets calcified by hydroxyapatite crystals. This process is going to require vitamin D, which enhances calcium absorption from the GI tract, vitamin C, which is a cofactor required for collagen formation, and of course calcium and phosphate for the actual calcification. Okay, so bone resorption. This is when the bone matrix is destroyed by osteoclasts. Osteoclasts have proteolytic enzymes in their lysosomes that chemically digest collagen and proteoglycans of bone matrix. They also have hydrochloric acid that they secrete, and this dissolves the calcium and phosphate. The calcium and phosphate then goes on to enter the bloodstream, and you'll see that this happens when blood calcium levels are low. So when your blood calcium levels are low, your osteoclast activity is going to increase to a point where your calcium levels in your blood return to normal. Okay, let's talk a little bit about microscopic anatomy of bone connective tissue. We'll start with compact bone. These compact bone is composed of small cylindrical structures called osteons. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as Haversian systems, but by and large, they're an osteon. This is the basic functional and structural unit of mature compact bone. They are oriented parallel to the bone diaphysis and appear as a bullseye target. So here you have the central canal. This is going to relay your blood vessels. Around it you have concentric lamellae, which is basically rings of bone tissue. You have osteocytes, these black kind of fuzzy looking guys, and they are stuck inside of little holes called lacunae. And then there are these tiny, tiny, tiny channels from osteocyte to osteocyte called canaliculi that allow them to send messages, receive nutrients, things like that, okay? The central canal, we said, is the opening. It has blood vessels and nerves. The concentric lamellae are the rings of bone that surround the central canal. This concentric lamellae contain collagen fibers, and this is what gives bone its strength and resilience. You have osteocytes. These are the mature bone cells found in those small spaces between the concentric lamellae called lacunae. These guys maintain the bone matrix. And then you've got canaliculi, which are these tiny channels within the bone, extend from each lacuna, travel through the lamellae, and connect to the central canal. So this is how exchange of nutrients, minerals, gases, and wastes is going to occur between blood vessels and osteocytes. So here's just another picture. This is showing an osteon. And look, they've taken the concentric lamellae and shown you how it forms different rings. Remember that the long part of the osteon, this is going to be parallel to the long part of the bone. Okay? Yes, you have a central canal with the nerve, artery, and vein. You have canaliculi extending from the osteocytes outwards. Here you have an osteocyte in its lacuna, and you can see the canaliculi even better there. And this is like a zoomed in portion of the osteon, so you can't see the entire osteon, you can only see a fragment of it, but this is the central canal with a capillary, and there would be a little venule there, and here's a little nerve. Now note that the central canal is lined by endosteum, right? These osteoblasts are part of the endosteum. You'll also see progenitor cells and osteoclasts as well, lining the central canal. Okay, so some questions. First question, what is the basic structural unit of compact bone? We know that it is B, the osteon. Which of the following best describes the central canal found in an osteon? Does it contain bone marrow? No, that's the medullary cavity. Does it house blood vessels and nerves? Yes, it does. So B is the correct answer. The central canal is where you can find the blood vessels and the nerves going through the bone. Which component of the osteon provides strength and resilience to compact bone? This is going to be A, the lamellae. And why? You go back. Oh, where is it? Here. Concentric lamellae have collagen fibers. That's what gives the bone its strength and resilience. So A, lamellae. How are osteons arranged within compact bone? A, randomly throughout the bone. B, in concentric circles parallel to the medullary cavity. C, parallel to the bone surface. Or D, irregularly with no specific orientation. The correct answer is B, in concentric circles parallel to the medullary cavity. Remember, so this is going to be parallel to the long axis of the bone. All right, next we'll talk about structures in long bone that is not part of an osteon. First, you have the perforating canals, or Volkmann's canals, and that's this down here. You'll see it's a place for blood vessels and nerves to travel through. It's perpendicular to the central canals, and it connects central canals within different osteons. Then you have interstitial lamellae. That's these rings here, kind of in between the osteons. And they're essentially incomplete osteons that make up this space between the completed osteons. Next, you have spongy bone. Spongy bone has trabeculae, which is a meshwork of crisscrossing bars of bones. You have bone marrow that fills the empty spaces of the spongy bone, and spongy bone is resistant to stresses. You have parallel lamellae in spongy bone instead of concentric lamellae. So parallel lamellae is composed of bone matrix, and it's going to have osteocytes between the lamellae and canaliculi radiating from the lacunae. So similar to the lamellae you see in compact bone, except it is arranged in a parallel fashion. And you can see that here, parallel lamellae. Here's an osteocyte in its lacuna. Here are the canaliculi. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about cartilage. So we'll talk first about hyaline cartilage. So hyaline cartilage is composed of cells scattered through a matrix of protein fibers as they are embedded in a gel-like ground substance. And this ground substance is going to include proteoglycans, but not calcium. Hyaline cartilage is resilient and flexible. It has a high percentage of water in it, which makes it highly compressible and a good shock absorber. It is, unlike bone, avascular and contains no nerves. Okay, you're going to see some parallels with bone tissue. For example, chondroblasts produce cartilage matrix. You've got chondrocytes, which are just chondroblasts encased within the matrix. Chondrocytes also occupy small spaces called lacunae, and they maintain the matrix, much like osteocytes maintain the bone. Then you have a perichondrium, and this is dense, irregular connective tissue that covers the cartilage and helps it maintain its shape. Okay, so here you can kind of see the similarities, right? Cells that form the matrix, they're going to be blasts. Just depends on whether it's osteo with bone or chondro with cartilage. The mature cells are cytes, so osteocytes with bone, chondrocytes with cartilage. Both of them have mature cells in lacunae. Calcium is only present in bone tissue, though. And the blood supply is extensive in bone, whereas there is no blood supply in cartilage. Okay, now let's talk about osteogenesis. So osteogenesis, or ossification, is the formation and development of bone connective tissue. This occurs by about the 8th through the 12th weeks of embryonic development and continues through childhood and adolescence. When it comes to the skeleton beginning to form, there's two ways that it does it. There's intramembranous ossification and there's endochondral ossification. Intramembranous ossification is where the bones form from thick mesenchyme. Endochondral ossification, which we'll talk about more in detail, is where bone forms from a hyaline cartilage model. Endochondral ossification, we said, begins with the cartilage model. This produces most bones of the skeleton. Most bones of the skeleton are going to be produced through endochondral ossification. An example of this process would be long bone development. Okay, so the first step is a hyaline cartilage model is formed. This happens because chondrocytes secrete cartilage matrix, and this forms the hyaline cartilage. What's going to happen next is the chondrocytes are going to hypertrophy, and the cartilage matrix is going to begin to calcify. Those chondrocytes then undergo apoptosis, or programmed cell death, and blood vessels begin growing. Osteoblasts then develop and start secreting osteoid, and then the osteoid is going to harden and form a periosteal bone collar. Okay, and you're going to get your first major center of bone formation in the diaphysis. Okay, and it's going to essentially grow the bone from the center towards the epiphyses. Then a secondary ossification center forms in the epiphyses. So it's going to be the same process that we talked about. Chondrocytes hypertrophying, calcifying, osteoblasts come in, secrete osteoid, the osteoid hardens, etc., etc., okay? Bone is going to replace almost all cartilage except for the articular cartilage, so that's the cartilage on the ends of your bones, and the epiphyseal cartilage. This is the growth plate cartilage, okay? Lengthwise growth is going to continue until the epiphyseal plates close and form epiphyseal lines. This can occur anywhere between ages 10 to 25, but most people it's somewhere around age 20. Okay, so let's look at all of that over the course of a developing fetus. So here at 8 to 12 weeks, you're going to have the fetal hyaline cartilage model develop. So you'll look, we're going to follow the humerus throughout this child's life. And you can see here in this fetus, all the bones are cartilage right now at this point. Next, what's going to happen is this cartilage matrix in the middle is going to start deteriorating, right? Those chondrocytes are going to hypertrophy. They're going to turn into osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are going to start forming there, and then they're going to start secreting osteoid. That's going to be your primary ossification center, right in the middle of that bone. And it's going to grow towards the ends of the bone. And then you get to birth and onwards, you will have the primary ossification center making up the diaphysis of the bone. And then you're going to have secondary ossification centers start to pop up here at the epiphyses. And you're going to eventually have a growth plate that's made of cartilage that is going to keep growing as the child develops. So here you have that, what was the primary ossification center is now making up the entire diaphysis. You have the secondary ossification centers here at the epiphyses, and now you have the epiphyseal plate, which is composed of cartilage. And this cartilage will continue to grow and grow and grow and be replaced by bone as the child grows. And then once you reach adulthood, the epiphyseal plates are going to close up, they're going to ossify, and that bone is going to be fully formed. All right, so questions. Which type of ossification ossification occurs directly from mesenchymal tissue without a cartilage intermediate? Well, remember, there were two kinds of ossification. There's endochondral ossification, which requires a cartilage model. And then there's intramembranous ossification, which does not require a cartilage model. So B, intramembranous ossification is the answer. Which of the following best describes the process of endochondral ossification? A, bone forms directly from mesenchymal tissue. Nope. B, cartilage is gradually replaced by bone. Yes, that is true. Okay, so more on bone growth and bone remodeling. We call, when the bone is growing in length, we call that interstitial growth. When a bone is growing in diameter or its thickness, we call that appositional growth. So let's talk about interstitial growth. This depends upon cartilage growth in the epiphyseal plate. And we're going to talk about 5 zones of the epiphyseal plate, okay? Zone 1 is the zone of resting cartilage. Zone 2 is the zone of proliferating cartilage. Zone 3 is the zone of hypertrophic cartilage. Zone 4 is the zone of calcified cartilage, and zone 5 is the zone of ossification. And you'll see this kind of as you go along in the zones, you're going to see the formation of bone. So number 1, the zone of resting cartilage. This is nearest the epiphysis. This is where small chondrocytes are distributed throughout the matrix, and it just looks like cartilage. It's essentially, that's why it says resting cartilage. This is just cartilage at rest. It secures the epiphysis to the epiphyseal plate. Next, you're going to have the zone of proliferating cartilage. This is where chondrocytes are going to undergo rapid mitotic division, and they're going to kind of align into these long columns of flattened lacunae. They look kind of like stacked coins. And these columns run parallel to the diaphysis. Next, you'll see the zone of hypertrophic cartilage. So these chondrocytes are going to stop dividing, and they're going to begin to hypertrophy. The walls of their lacunae will become thin. Next is the zone of calcified cartilage. There will be about 2 to 3 layers of chondrocytes. Minerals are going to be deposited between the columns of lacunae, and this is going to destroy those chondrocytes. Finally, you have the zone of ossification. This is where the walls break down between lacunae and the columns. Those spaces are invaded by capillaries and osteoprogenitor cells, and new bone matrix is deposited on the calcified cartilage matrix. So this shows you what all those zones look like. So here's the resting cartilage. Looks like normal hyaline cartilage. Next, you have the zone of proliferating cartilage, and you can see these chondrocytes are undergoing rapid mitotic division. They're just dividing one after another, after another, after another, and after another, creating these long columns that look like stacked coins. Next, you have the zone of hypertrophic cartilage. So you can see these chondrocytes enlarging, and then they're going to calcify. That's the next step. They become calcified, and those chondrocytes begin to die. Finally, the area ossifies, so the hydroxyapatite gets laid down over the collagen fibers, crystals form, and you have your bone matrix. Okay, what is the primary process involved in interstitial growth of long bones? Well, the primary process involved is going to be lengthening of bones through the proliferation of chondrocytes, or B. In the epiphyseal plate, which zone is responsible for the active division of chondrocytes, contributing to the lengthening of the bone? Active division of chondrocytes, that's going to be B, the zone of proliferation. And if I can show you right here, the zone of proliferation, this is what makes the bone grow. Okay, so bone remodeling. New bone is continuously being laid down, and old bone is continuously being resorbed in your body. This happens throughout all of adulthood. This occurs at the periosteal and the endosteal surfaces of bone. Remember, the periosteum has that intercellular layer that has osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts, and so does the endosteum. Bone remodeling is going to occur at different rates depending on which part of the bone you're in. For example, the distal part of the femur is replaced about every 4 to 6 months, while the diaphysis of the femur is not completely replaced over an entire lifetime. Every year, about 20% of your skeleton is replaced, and this is dependent upon the coordinated activities of osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts, and it's influenced by hormones and mechanical stress. Mechanical stress occurs in weight-bearing movement and exercise, and it's required for normal bone remodeling. What happens is the osteocytes detect mechanical stress and talk to the osteoblasts, and they then increase the synthesis of osteoid. This causes an increase in bone strength. So weightlifting, walking, and running, all of those activities are going to increase your bone mass. Hormones also influence bone growth and remodeling. Hormones, we learned, are molecules that are released from cell into the blood. They travel through the bloodstream and will bind to the cellular receptors that they are designed for. And then they will initiate specific cellular changes. Hormones can alter activity rates of chondrocytes, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts, and can affect bone composition and growth patterns. All right, so let's look at some of the effects of hormones on bone maintenance and growth. First, you have growth hormone, which, as the name suggests, will cause the cartilage to proliferate at the epiphyseal plate and result in bone growth. Thyroid hormone, this is kind of what's in charge of your resting metabolic rate. So how fast your metabolic reactions are occurring. And it's going to stimulate bone growth by increasing the metabolic rate of osteoblasts. Calcitonin is going to promote calcium deposition in bone, and it's going to inhibit osteoclast activity. So all of that is going to decrease blood calcium. Calcitriol and parathyroid hormone are going to increase blood calcium. Calcitriol stimulates the absorption of calcium ions from the small intestine, and parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels by encouraging bone resorption by the osteoclasts. The sex hormones have effects on the osteoblasts. They promote epiphyseal plate growth and then closure. So testosterone in lower amounts is going to encourage epiphyseal plate growth, and then at higher amounts it's going to encourage closure of those epiphyseal plates. In fact, if you have too high of a testosterone level, you can have premature closure of those plates and end up being quite short. Glucocorticoids, this increases bone loss and in children will impair bone growth when there are chronically high levels of glucocorticoids. This is one of the reasons why you don't want patients to be on steroids for a long time, because it starts damaging your bones. And then serotonin inhibits osteoprogenitor cells from differentiating into osteoblasts when there are chronically high levels of serotonin. Okay, let's talk about regulating blood calcium levels. So it's essential to regulate calcium concentration because calcium is required for the initiation of muscle contraction, exocytosis of molecules from cells, including neurons. So how you release neurotransmitters is going to be calcium dependent. Calcium stimulates the heart, helps the pacemaker cells stimulate the heart, and it's involved in blood clotting. So there are two primary hormones that are going to increase blood calcium levels. It's going to be calcitriol and parathyroid hormone. Calcitriol production we learned a little bit about in the integumentary system. See, what happens is you have a precursor molecule that gets hit with ultraviolet light and it becomes vitamin D3. Or you drink a yummy glass of milk which contains vitamin D3. So now you have vitamin D3 in your system. What happens is it's going to travel to the liver where it gets converted into calcidiol, and then calcidiol goes to the kidneys where it gets converted into calcitriol. Parathyroid hormone is secreted and released by parathyroid glands, that's right next to your thyroid gland, in response to decreased blood calcium levels. What is going to happen is it accelerates the conversion to calcitriol by kidneys. It also is going to cause osteoclasts to resorb bone, thus releasing calcium into the blood. PTH and calcitriol are also going to stimulate the kidneys to excrete less calcium in urine. And calcitriol increases the absorption of calcium from the small intestine into the blood. Okay, so here we have feedback mechanism. We have a stimulus, low blood calcium levels. We have our receptor, which is the parathyroid glands. They're going to detect low blood calcium levels and send a signal to the control center. So the control center is the parathyroid gland, and it releases parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone then goes on to exert its effects on bone, kidneys, and calcitriol then will also act on the small intestine. All of this is going to restore homeostasis, increasing blood calcium levels back to normal. All right, rickets disease is actually due to vitamin D deficiency during childhood. It's going to cause your bones not to calcify properly, and children with rickets disease have a bow-legged appearance because the bones are softer and tend to bend. We see increasing numbers in the U.S. because children are spending more time indoors, so they're not getting vitamin D from the sun, and they're opting for soft drinks, so they're not getting vitamin D through their diet either. Calcitonin plays a less significant role than PTH or calcitriol. It is released from the thyroid gland in response to high blood calcium levels, and it inhibits osteoclast activity. This is going to cause a decrease in blood calcium levels. This also stimulates kidneys to increase the loss of calcium in the urine, so this reduces blood calcium levels as well. So calcitonin basically comes in when the blood calcium is too high and it stops the osteoclasts and tells the kidneys to waste calcium. All right, osteoporosis. This is a decreased bone mass causing weakened bones that are prone to fracture. Increased people at risk are older people, especially white women, in the onset of menopause, and a history of smoking. Postmenopausal women are at most risk because they produce less estrogen. There's an increased incidence of fracture, especially at the wrist, the hip, and the vertebral column. In the vertebral column, we tend to see compression fractures, where the vertebrae bodies basically compress into tiny little wedges. The best treatment is prevention with diet and physical activity, but medical treatments are going to try to slow the rate of bone loss and try to stimulate new bone growth. All right, which hormone is released in response to low blood calcium levels and promotes the conversion of vitamin D to its active form? Low blood calcium levels. So this is going to be B, parathyroid hormone, okay? It basically tells osteoclasts to start resorbing bone, and that releases calcium into the bloodstream. It's also going to convert vitamin D to vitamin D3, vitamin D3 to calcidiol and then calcitriol, okay? Which hormone is primarily responsible for stimulating growth plate activity during puberty, leading to increased bone length? Out of all of these choices, the correct choice is B, testosterone. Testosterone is primarily responsible for stimulating growth plate activity. What role does calcitonin play in bone remodeling? Well, remember, calcitonin is going to inhibit osteoclast activity, reducing bone resorption. So B, inhibits osteoclast activity. And what's that going to do? That's going to decrease blood calcium levels. In addition to affecting bone, which hormone also influences the metabolism of calcium in the kidneys directly and the small intestine indirectly? This is going to be D, parathyroid hormone. So remember, it's going to increase the conversion of vitamin D to calcitriol, and indirectly, because you've increased calcitriol is going to increase uptake of calcium in the small intestine. So parathyroid hormone has a role in both the kidneys and the small intestine, albeit indirectly. All right, bone fracture and repair. So a break in a bone is called a fracture, and this results from unusual stress or sudden impact on the bone. There's an increased incidence with age, and this is due to the normal thinning and weakening of bone. There are a few different types of fractures you should know about. The first is a stress fracture. This is a thin break in the bone that's caused by increased physical activity, usually due to repetitive motions. So someone like a runner might get a stress fracture in their shins. You can have a pathologic fracture. This is a fracture that occurs in a bone weakened by disease. For example, if you had a cancerous tumor growing in your bone, that's going to destroy the bone tissue, and that's going to leave you more likely to break the bone in that area. You can have a simple fracture. This is a broken bone that doesn't penetrate the skin. Or you can have a compound or open fracture, and this is where one or both ends of the bone pierce the overlying skin. Fracture healing. For a simple fracture, it takes about 3 months to heal. For a compound fracture, it'll take even longer, and healing slows with age. Some people are going to require surgical intervention to heal correctly, to heal the bone correctly, to line the pieces back up. So there's 4 steps of bone fracture repair. The first step is the fracture hematoma forms from clotted blood. So what happens is the periosteum gets torn, and those blood vessels bleed into the fracture and form a hematoma. Next, a soft callus forms out of fibrocartilaginous tissue. This is regenerated blood capillaries are going to infiltrate the hematoma. Fibroblasts are going to be there. They're going to produce collagen fibers. Chondroblasts are going to form dense, regular connective tissue. And then you're going to have what is called a procallus become a fibrocartilaginous callus, or a soft callus. Next, the hard or bony callus forms. This is due to osteoblasts adjacent to the callus. They produce trabeculae. This replaces the soft callus and forms a bony callus, which continues to grow and thicken. Then the bone is going to be remodeled. This is the final phase of fracture repair. Osteoclasts are going to go in and remove excess bony material from that hard callus. The compact bone is going to replace the primary bone that was formed, and this usually leaves a slight thickening of bone. And you can see that here. There's a little bit of thickening at the fracture site. So here, first step, a fracture hematoma forms. So you've torn these blood vessels. Now they're bleeding into the fracture. You have a hematoma. The hematoma is going to basically tampen off the bleeding blood vessels, putting pressure on them, stopping the bleeding. Next, you have the formation of a soft callus, then the formation of a bony callus, and then that bony callus gets remodeled. And you can see here, this primary bone has been removed. You're back to the medullary cavity, and your compact bone is restored. What is the primary distinction between an open fracture and a closed fracture? Well, remember, an open fracture is going to pierce the skin. The bone is going to pierce the skin, and a closed fracture, the bone remains in the tissues. So the answer is B. An open fracture is accompanied by visible bone through the skin, while a closed fracture does not break the skin. Which of the following stages occurs first in the process of fracture repair? Well, if you go back and look, the first step is a fracture hematoma forms. So B, hematoma formation.